One of the primary focuses of a reading teacher in a classroom is that their students would know the main characters in a story. Some of you may have read something at some point, and as you read through it, you thought, I don't really have any idea what's going on. I've read a few books in time where I didn't quite grasp it myself. But if you know the characters, then you know a crucial part, because the characters serve as a focal point in the story. The actions of the character, the motivations of the character drive the point. I've read a few books in time where it's been primarily about one character, but out of nowhere, they throw somebody else in for a few chapters, and then they just disappear, and you think, what was this person there for? But the more you read, the more you get involved with the character, that you have an emotional reaction to it. In the story, whatever it might be, there are characters that you absolutely love, and there are characters that you do not like at all. Now, this is typically something that happens in a novel. But even if you're reading something that's nonfiction, even if you're reading a news story, you can find characters in the story that you like and characters or actions in the story that you dislike. And if I were to ask you to go to the book of Genesis and I were to say, tell me about some of the main characters in that book, who would you mention? Well, God would probably be one of the main characters, although that's an odd description. That's maybe more of a narrator than it is a character, but I think you would include that. Early in the story, almost from the beginning, you see Adam and Eve, and you see an interesting plot line of not doing what they're supposed to be doing that happens in every story. You might not go far before you hear about or read about Noah and the people connected to Noah, maybe about Abraham and the covenant. But you wouldn't go far before the character on the screen was mentioned or that was presented to you. And that's the character of Isaac. And so a couple of things about Isaac to start with. What do you know about it? Well, first of all, Isaac was the child of an elderly couple. Before you get to Isaac, you see Isaac mentioned. Abraham and Sarah and this promise of a child. But as you read, the child never really seems to come, right? And perhaps by the time Isaac, you're so invested that you've wanted to see this character appear for some time. You see that Isaac is an obedient son. You see that Isaac was respected by God to carry the promise on to another generation. You could say that Isaac is an essential character. In fact, when there is a reference back in the scriptures, Isaac's name is one that's mentioned. You'll often hear Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, you might hear Elijah. But there are some characters whose name you don't hear. Isaac is one that you do. So what I want to talk about tonight is, why is Isaac essential? Why does Isaac matter? I want you to turn in that book of Genesis, chapter 17 is where we're going to look at tonight. And then we'll look a few other places as well. But let's start with Genesis chapter 17, and we're going to read verses 15 through 19. As we said a moment ago, this is where Isaac, I guess, is introduced, for lack of a better way of describing it. And then starting in verse 15, it says, Then God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, or Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and, notice this, laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, that Ishmael might live before you. Then God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. Now we're going to read more here in just a second, but this is an interesting plot twist, right? This is the introduction of a child to an elderly couple. And as the reader, you would read this and you would say, well, this probably doesn't make sense, right? I get the concept of a mother and a father and a child, but you're looking at this and you're thinking, okay, age seems interesting here. How is this going to work? You might be closing your book right there and say, okay, well, let's just guess. Maybe they're going to adopt. Sometimes elderly people adopt. Or you might guess what they end up doing. Maybe they're going to try and pull a little switcheroo, as it were, with Ishmael. You know, we got that story. Maybe that's what. If you're trying to guess the situation, who knows where it's going to go? Let's jump over to Genesis chapter 21, though, and read the first 3 verses. Genesis 21, verses 1 through 3. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. And we'll stop there because you'll see, okay, well, it took 2 chapters, but we see how it worked. But we also see how that there was sort of a hand in this situation, right? Chapter 21 says the Lord visited Sarah, sort of made this work as it was. But when they read it, as we read there, then it also says, well, as it says there, then it was Sarah who gives birth to the child. They named him Isaac, which is something that they had said that they were going to do there as well. I need the thing. We're struggling tonight, folks. So if we pick up there where we left off, Isaac's birth is one of the clearest demonstrations of God's faithfulness in the face of what we would call impossibility. This is something that doesn't make sense to us, but it maybe does make sense with God helping out. 25 years had passed since the initial promise. I think they find that initial promise in Genesis chapter 12. And 25 years had passed. And as you might would imagine, there was probably a lot of time during that 25 years where they thought, well, wonder if this is going to happen or not. Wonder how this is going to happen. And you start looking at yourself and you start thinking, well, I don't think it's going to happen for me, right? Maybe it may not happen this way. But Isaac's promise, Isaac's appearance, I guess, reminds us that God's promise depends on his power, not on our performance. I think we struggle with that sometimes. We say, God's told us to go do this and that. Maybe the best examples we think about is at the end of the book of Matthew when we're told to go into all the world, preach and teach. Well, it's really the apostles that are told, but we still use that. But then we say, well, I went and talked to somebody about the church and they showed no. Boy, I tell you what, I messed up. I just didn't do it right. Didn't talk the right way. You ever done that to yourself? What if I had said this or this or this instead of that? Well, I think you'll notice I said the word I there a lot, right? We're using human performance. We're saying, I didn't get the job done there, as it were. Well, we read in the New Testament about the parable about sowing the seed, right? falls in a lot of different places. But our job is to water. Our job is to teach. It may not work. It may not work. Dad was telling me the other day about the grapes that they had grown, and they planted them a couple years ago, and they didn't do anything, right? But they stuck with it. They did a little bit of work. This year, they got all kinds of grapes and all kinds of jelly that came from it. But it took a little bit of work. And sometimes there was probably frustration. I'm sure the same thing happened with Abraham and Sarah right here. Often, though, we look at this and we say, well, it's not working this way. I'm going to try and do something completely different. You'll remember that this promise had been made, and Abraham sort of took it into his own hands, right? He has a child with Hagar. You know, I'll sort of speed this along, maybe is what he's thinking. I'll have this child with this maid, and you know, this will be good enough. It'll be what it was. Well, it wasn't good enough. It ends up causing a lot of problems that still seem to exist in the world even today. But it caused a whole lot of problems, all because they didn't trust the plan that God had put forward. Just as Isaac's birth came by God's power, the new birth for us in Christ comes by the Spirit. In the 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 20, we read that all the promises of God in him are yes, and in him, amen, to the glory of God through he will complete. But where we struggle is that we want it completed on our time frame, right? We want most everything completed on our time frame. I want it done, and I want it done yesterday is how we sort of, but that's not necessarily the way that God does it. Let's go forward. Genesis chapter 22, and I've got this on my paper because we're going to make a couple of jumps here as we go, but I want you to look at Genesis chapter 22, first, verses 1 and 2. We've seen Isaac born. We've talked about that. Now we're going to push Isaac forward into a young man. Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, we read, Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. And we'll stop there. We'll skip ahead in just a second. But this, again, pushes our story forward. We see that God calls on Abraham. He says, Abraham says, I'm right here. He's responding to it. And he says, I want you to take this son. Notice that he says, your only son. That sort of negates Ishmael from the past because that was not done the way God wanted it to be done. But he says, your only son, Isaac. Then he also says, whom you love. So there's no situation here where we say, well, they had this kid and it was just a disaster. No, they clearly love him right there. And then he says, go to the land of Moriah. Okay, that makes sense. Let's go a little further and offer him. Let me go back and look real quick. There as a burnt offering. So most of the first two verses made a lot of sense, right? But it gets a little tricky right there at the last part. That seems interesting. So what if you're thinking, if you're reading this story for the first time? Well, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, the kid that they promised, that they waited till they was 100 years old to have, they're going to take him and kill him? That seems odd, right? So we're thinking, is that's the main character? We're going to kill off what would appear to be a main character right here. Let's jump ahead just a bit. Verses 6 through 8 right here. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. And so the two of them went off together. So now, if we're reading this, if we're pushing the story forward just a little bit, we see that it goes on. Isaac takes his load of the wood, right? He's like, well, I'm carrying up wood because that's what you do when you got to have a burnt offering. And Abraham's got all the stuff we read there. It had a fire, he had a knife. They're climbing all the way up. But there's a valid question presented there, right? Last weekend, Mary and I went away for a couple of days, and Mary was joking on the way. She said, well, I always forget something, but I think I've got everything. And we got there. We wasn't there long, and Mary said, I forgot this. Wasn't long. We was counting on two hands the number of things that we forgot, right? Most of it just had ourselves, I think. But we had got to this point, we thought, we forgot something. You've done that before, right? And so Isaac presents a really good point. We got all the stuff. It seems like Isaac has been a part of this before, but he says, there's one thing missing, right? And kind of a big thing that's missing. You know, if you forgot the wood, we can probably find some brush laying around. You know, we might be able to make a fire, as it were. Well, a knife is handy. Maybe we could break it if we had. But the one thing that's missing is one thing that's kind of key. Abraham said, God will provide. Let's go forward. Verses 13 and 14. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be praised. Right there, you would see Abraham was prepared. But at the last minute, to use a term that we might use in a book, the last minute, he stops him. And there's a ram there that's able to be sacrificed instead. Now, this moment here on the mount seems to reveal God's plan for redemption. Abraham's willingness to offer Isaac is not about cruelty, but about demonstrating faith. And there's a difference. I think if we're asking for honesty from Abraham, there was probably some nerves in him as they ascended that hill. Would have had to have been, right? But he didn't say, well, as we go up the hill, this guy doesn't have a clue what he's talking about, but we'll just see what he said. He said that God would provide. There was probably some nerves in him. It would have had to have been. But he was faithful to God, believing that God would provide. Hebrews chapter 11, if you jump all the way to almost the end of your Bible, verses 17, 18, and 19, we read that by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. I want you to think about that verse there for just a second. This is a New Testament retelling of the story, but notice in Hebrews 11 and verse 17, it said, by faith, he offered up his son Isaac. Now you go back and you say, well, he doesn't actually kill him, but it seems to me that God interpreted that as he went as far as he was supposed to go, right? He offered his son up, because we jump down to verse 19, it says he also received him in a figurative sense. That counted for God. It counted. What he did was he showed enough faith that God took care. Who knows what would have happened if Abraham had actually went up that hill and thought, well, this is dumb. This won't work. Why are they doing that? That's not the character of Abraham. But we often tell this story about Abraham, and we sometimes don't tell the story of Isaac. And this would have been a traumatic, to use the word maybe that we would use today, but this certainly would have been an experience for Isaac. Obedience can seem unbearable, but that's where trust comes in. Parallels between Isaac and Jesus are remarkable. You ever been reading a story, reading a book, and there's a character that seems a whole lot like another character? There's a lot of different books that are like this. And sometimes the same book is making parallel cases forth. I think of the the Dickens story. It's the best of times, it was worst of times. And it's in England and it's in France during the French Revolution. And the two people are kind of going through the story there at the same time. But you can make some parallels right there. But first of all, Isaac was the beloved son, promised and miraculously born. Who does that sound like? Jesus, or God says about Jesus, this is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased, right? There was promise that came through Jesus, his miraculous birth as well. Isaac carried the wood up the mountain to the altar. Maybe you know the story about Jesus carrying the cross, right? God provided a substitute in Isaac's place. Us is that substitute for humanity. John chapter 1 and verse 29, we read that the next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him. And you've probably heard this before, but John said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." That was the replacement. There was a lamb that worked as a replacement for Abraham and Isaac as well. Sometimes when we try to compare people, we stretch the metaphor maybe a little too thin, or the analogy can be stretched a little too thin. This is pretty thick font right here. This comparison is quite similar between both. Faith leads to surrender, and surrender opens the door for God's provision. God provides exactly what we need, often in ways beyond our own understanding. But what we got to do is get out of the way and let it happen. Let's go forward to Genesis chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26, verses 2 through 5. We're going to read again real quick, but this is what Jimmy read just a few moments ago. And we've seen Isaac grow up by this point. We're no longer little kid Isaac, but instead we are seeing adult Isaac. Genesis 26, we're going to read verses 2 through 5, and then we'll skip down and read a couple more verses as well. It says, "Then the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws.'" Let's skip ahead to verse 23 and 24 real quick. It says, "Then he went up from there to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, 'I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake.'" Isaac represents the continuity of God's plan. His story isn't as dramatic as that of Abraham. He recounts that story, God is, when he's talking to him in verses 2 to 5 that Jimmy was reading right there. And he's really saying, I'm going to bless you because of what your father did. He's saying that your father made some tough decisions to be faithful and follow me, and you're going to be blessed as a result. But notice in that reading, it said in chapter 26 and verse 2, it says, don't go down to Egypt. That's an interesting way of saying it, right? Because we're looking for, in a story that's moving along, we're looking for a dramatic scene, right? There should be a dramatic scene where they go down to Egypt and take over or whatever, right? But it's not what he says. Just stay right here. I'll provide the place for you, is in a sense what he says. Sometimes we look for a dramatic piece of the story. Ben mentioned this morning in his class, he said that he thinks everything on television is too dramatic. It's over the top drama. It's almost like when there's just not a dramatic scene, we're like, what is that? That's not probably new, because we could read this and say the same thing right there, right? We're looking for some dramatic scene, It didn't really happen. But sometimes in the story, there's a steadiness that has to be there. There's a steady faithfulness that's essential. As you might imagine, teaching school for as long as I've done it, I've seen a lot of drama. I could tell you stories about things that I don't ever want to hear, but I heard every bit of it. Some of it was true. Most of it was probably made up. Usually I'll describe those stories, but before I even tell Mary, I'll say, she's a lot. You know what I mean, right? Some of the best kids, though, are the ones that come every day, do what they're supposed to do, have polite and kind words to say to you, and when the bell rings, they go do the same thing in math or science class as well. You're a lot better off with the steady than you are with the drama. As Christians, we have to be steady in our faithfulness as well. It was through Isaac that the covenant moved from promise to permanence. And there's a difference between the two things. Genesis 26 and verse 4, we just read a second ago, I will make your descendants multiply as the stars. I will give your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of earth shall be blessed. Isaac, the character that doesn't really seem to have anything exciting happening, the word all appears 3 times in that verse. Wasn't just a one-time gift either. His blessings still flow. If you go to the New Testament, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 29, we read, if you are Christ, it says, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So if we are Christ, meaning if we are Christians, if we are followers of Christ, we are heirs to the same promise that Abraham was. Well, guess who Isaac was? He's Abraham's son, right? Isaac would have been the heir to Abraham no matter what, as a family member. You're not a family member to him, but it says through Christ, you're heir to the exact same thing. So that promise that was made in Genesis 26 and verse 4 that was made to Isaac and his descendants, all, guess who you are? You're in the all, right? You live half a world away from where that took place, but you're in the all nations that's mentioned right there. We're called to carry the covenant forward as well. Not by bloodlines, as we said, but we carry it forward through Christ. Isaac's calm and consistent life are a good example for us. Sometimes God's greatest work is not done through dramatic moments. It changes His purpose across generation to generation. A couple weeks ago, as we finished up the gospel meeting, I went back and looked at every person who had spoke as a gospel meeting back to about 2009 here at this building. And I looked at those people, and some of them I remembered well. Some of them I had some vague memories of. Some of them were not able to come back because of age or infirmity, illness for themselves or illness for others. But I thought about how many of those people go week to week preaching and teaching all around the world. And we remember those people and we say, oh, he was really good. Oh, I really liked him. Those lessons were so easy to understand. I don't have a list of every person who's here every Sunday and every Wednesday. But I dare say that those people play an even bigger role in keeping forward than even the traveling gospel preacher. Because the preacher comes for a week and moves on. That's the nature of the job. That's the dramatic part of the job. But it's the steady essential of people like Ella here every time. People like Shorty, sick this morning, singing on the way. People like Johnny can't be with us in the morning because of health, but he's able to be with us every time. And the first thing Johnny says to me when I walk in is, "I love you, brother." He says that to me every time. I look at kids like Will and Dusty, Jameson, Henry, Max, Eliana, Cambry, little ones, and I see that's what will happen for the future. I think about older folks long since gone. Empty seats that you remember who sat there and how they played a pivotal role in keeping this church going. I'll be honest, when I look at Johnny every time, I actually think about Ben's mom sitting right there. That was her seat. Turn sideways. Johnny, you don't throw your leg up in the seat like Carolyn did. Ron and Joyce, Alice Bowen, Christine, who somehow walked up the steps every church service when she probably should have come in the easier way on the back. Ida Denham. I don't want to keep going because I'll forget them. Catherine Horseman. Tom's wife, Debbie Bentley. Not for a long period of time, but boy, it's good when she was here, right? That steadiness is what makes a church go. You might look around and say, 29 last Sunday and 33 here today. Add those together, and that's about half of what a lot of churches may have had just this morning. There's something to be said for quality. And every single one of you are quality. You're the Isaac of this generation. You keep it going all the way through. Isaac's essential because he proves God's faithfulness to his promises. Isaac's essential because he sets the stage for what Christ would do for us later. Isaac's essential because he preserved a line that would be salvation for us all. When this life is over, when we get to our eternal home in heaven, it's exciting to think that people like Isaac would be there. But maybe it's more exciting to think about the people that we mentioned just a moment ago who've paved the way for us and will be waiting when this life is over. If there's anything that we can do for you, any way that we can help, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.